Hey guys, tonight we begin with Babylon, the city that later generations kept trying to turn into a warning, a dream, a monster, and a miracle, depending on what they needed. Picture it first without the golden fog. Not as a perfect skyline of towers and gardens, not as a movie palace floating above the desert, not as the symbol of luxury and doom later writers handed down. Picture river mud, brick moulds, reed baskets, bare feet near the Euphrates, the slow scrape of a worker lifting wet clay into shape. A city like Babylon did not begin as a legend. It began as a problem of water, food, labour, gods, kings, and storage. It began with the ancient question every city asks, even when it is too proud to admit it. How do you make thousands of people live close together without the whole thing collapsing into hunger, debt, disease, boredom, and a surprisingly large number of arguments about who owns the grain? And Babylon, over many centuries, became one of the most famous answers. It stood in southern Mesopotamia, in what is now Iraq, near the Euphrates River, in a land where abundance was never simple. Rainfall alone could not be trusted. The river could give life, but only if people cut canals, cleared silt, argued over water rights, repaired embankments, and accepted that civilization sometimes means standing ankle-deep in mud because the ditch has ideas of its own. Later, Babylon would be remembered for walls, kings, gods, astronomy, law, exile, conquest, and blue glazed brick. But beneath all of that was the older truth. Wealth had to be managed before it could be displayed. That is the fantasy we are going to gently break tonight. Babylon was rich, yes. At times it was spectacularly rich. It became the capital of empires, the holy city of Marduk, the place where kings wanted to be seen as more than kings, and the name later cultures reached for when they needed a city large enough to carry their fears. Hammurabi made it a royal centre in the 18th century BCE. Much later, Nebuchadnezzar II rebuilt it into the enormous Neo-Babylonian capital that dazzled outsiders. In 539 BCE, Cyrus of Persia took it, and the city passed into another imperial story. But Babylon was never only a pile of treasure with a dramatic lighting budget. It was a machine. A beautiful machine, sometimes. A sacred machine, certainly. A very well-documented machine when the scribes were having a productive day. But still a machine. Water in, grain out, labour counted, taxes recorded. Gods honoured, bricks stamped, walls raised, captives moved, kings praised, and everyone beneath the palace roof reminded that greatness usually arrives with paperwork. So before we enter the gate, if you enjoy slow history told with a little darkness, a little warmth, and the occasional ancient bureaucrat ruining everyone's evening, you can like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there, because somewhere out there, someone is listening at 2:17 in the morning while an ancient city made of mud brick tries to become immortal. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing to understand about Babylon is that its most famous form was not its first form. Because a city with a 4,000-year shadow is very easy to flatten. We see the name and our minds instantly decorate it. Blue gates, tall walls, hanging gardens maybe, though those gardens are a problem we will handle carefully later, because ancient wonder lists are not the same thing as building permits. A king staring over battlements, priests moving through temple courts, foreign captives looking up at a city that is both breathtaking and terrifying, because beauty built by empire always has a second face. But the earliest Babylon was not yet that giant. In the late 3rd and early 2nd millennia BCE, southern Mesopotamia was already old with cities. Ur, Uruk, Nippur, and other centres had their own sacred weight, their own gods, their own archives, their own pride. Babylon had to grow inside a crowded historical neighbourhood. It was not inventing urban life from nothing. It was entering a world where writing, temples, kingship, irrigation, and trade already had long memories. Imagine arriving at a dinner where every other guest is already famous, wearing a better robe, and has brought tablets proving their ancestry. Babylon's later confidence can make us forget that it began as one city among others. Then came the kings who understood that location and timing could be turned into destiny. Under the Amorite dynasty, and especially under Hammurabi, who ruled roughly from 1792 to 1750 BCE, Babylon rose from regional importance into a capital with reach. Hammurabi is remembered today mostly because of his law code, that stern monument of royal justice with its famous image of the king before the sun god Shamash. The code was not a modern constitution, and it was not the only law people lived by. It was royal performance as much as legal record, a way of saying, order has a voice, and the king is allowed to speak in it. Still, it tells us something crucial about Babylon's world. Wealth needed rules. Debt needed rules. Marriage, inheritance, wages, injury, property, tenancy, and status needed rules. In a city that gathered people, goods, fields, contracts, and obligations, law was not a decoration. It was one of the walls. And not all walls are made of brick. That is where Babylon becomes interesting in the quiet way, the way that does not fit neatly into postcards. The city's greatness did not rest only on having more gold or taller gates. It rested on making human life legible. A field became a measure, a harvest became a number, a worker became a ration, a debt became a tablet, a temple offering became an entry, a royal victory became an inscription. Even a brick could become propaganda if you stamped the king's name into it before it dried. There is something almost funny about that, if you allow yourself the dry kind of laugh history deserves. A king dreams of eternity, and the method is basically labelling construction materials. Nebuchadnezzar II, many centuries after Hammurabi, had his name stamped on bricks by the thousands, because nothing says, "My glory shall never perish," like forcing future archaeologists to read your building supplies. But the joke has a serious centre. In Mesopotamia, writing was power not because it was mystical, but because it stayed put. A spoken promise could vanish. A clay tablet could sit in the ground for 2,500 years, waiting patiently for someone with a trowel and sore knees. So when we talk about Babylon as the richest city in the ancient world, we have to ask what richness meant. It was not just treasure sparkling in a palace room. It was the ability to pull grain from fields and move it into storehouses. It was the ability to command labour when canals failed or walls needed repair. It was caravans, boats, scribes, priests, soldiers, judges, merchants, and families bound together by obligations that could be blessed by a god, enforced by an official, or pressed into a tablet while the clay was still soft. Babylonian wealth was not silent. It rustled in reeds, clinked in weights, bleated in animals, scraped in styluses, and dried in the sun. And somewhere in that soundscape, a person who did not care about empire still had to wake up hungry, sweep a floor, carry water, worry about debt, bargain badly in a market, listen to priests chant, and hope the river behaved itself. The river is the first real wall, even before the bricks rise around you. To understand Babylon from the ground instead of from the legend, you have to stand beside the Euphrates and notice how strange wealth looks before it becomes impressive. It does not look like a crown. It looks like mud under a fingernail. It looks like a canal bank that has slumped during the night. It looks like men and women carrying baskets, boys driving animals, officials checking measures, and someone with a reed stylus making small marks because the city cannot remember itself without help. Southern Mesopotamia was generous in the way a difficult relative can be generous. Everything valuable came with a demand attached. The land could produce astonishing harvests when irrigation worked. Date palms, barley fields, gardens, reeds, fish, animals, clay, and river traffic could all feed a city's appetite. But the same environment could turn against you through flood, salinity, silt, neglect, invasion, or simple human quarrels over who opened which canal gate at the wrong hour. Babylon's richness therefore began with a bargain. People accepted work, rules, hierarchy, and record-keeping because the alternative was not romantic freedom. It was a dry field, a broken levee, and dinner becoming theoretical. This is why brick matters so much. Brick is the city in its smallest, honest unit. A Babylonian brick begins as local earth mixed with water and straw, pressed into shape, dried in the sun, sometimes fired, sometimes glazed, sometimes stamped with a royal name, as if mud itself needed to learn obedience. One brick is dull. Thousands become a wall. Millions become a city that can frighten ambassadors, shelter priests, impress merchants, and convince a king that he has negotiated successfully with time. But a brick is also labour you can hold. Before it is architecture, it is someone bending, lifting, drying, stacking, carrying, and doing it again. That is the quiet joke inside ancient grandeur. Every empire wants to be remembered as a shining idea. Every empire, if you walk close enough, is mostly logistics with a better hat. Babylon's great streets, temples and gates came much later in their most famous form, especially under Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century BCE. But long before the city wore blue glazed brick like ceremonial clothing, it had to master the ordinary grammar of urban survival. Grain had to come in, rations had to go out. Animals had to be counted. Boats had to be loaded. Workers had to be assigned. Offerings had to reach the gods, because in Babylon, the divine world was not decoration. It was an operating system. The city's patron god Marduk was not just a statue in a temple. He was a claim about cosmic order, political legitimacy, and the right of Babylon to sit at the centre of the story. That can sound abstract until you imagine the temple kitchens. A temple was not only a quiet religious building where people whispered respectfully and tried not to cough during the sacred bit. It was a household for a god, with food, personnel, property, rituals, storage, land, and status. Offerings did not float up as pure feeling, they had to be prepared. Bread, beer, meat, oil, dates, textiles, incense, vessels, and labour moved through a sacred economy that looked, from close range, a lot like administration wearing perfume. Priests and temple workers maintained the god's presence, but that presence also anchored the city's authority. If Marduk was great, Babylon mattered. If Babylon mattered, its king mattered, and if the king mattered, everyone could be asked to help repair the wall. Convenient, really. The gods had excellent timing. Still, it would be too easy and too modern to treat religion as a trick. For Babylonians, divine order was part of reality. The movements of stars, the interpretation of omens, the proper performance of ritual, the prosperity of fields, and the stability of kingship all belonged to the same fabric. A bad omen was not a private mood, it was information. A festival was not just public entertainment, it renewed the relationship between heaven, ruler, and city. During the New Year festival, the Akitu, Babylon's religious and political imagination came into motion. The king's authority could be ritually humbled and restored. Marduk's supremacy could be celebrated. The city could tell itself, once again, that order had survived another year. And cities need to hear that. Because underneath the ritual music, Babylon was always vulnerable. The Euphrates was lifeblood, but also boundary, highway, hazard, and memory. Boats could bring goods and news, canals could extend power into fields, but water systems require maintenance in the same dull, relentless way bodies require breathing. Stop for too long, and the whole miracle begins to cough. Silt gathers, banks weaken, channels shift, fields suffer. People blame officials, neighbours, gods, foreigners, or whoever last looks suspicious near a shovel. This is where the city becomes more than a place. It becomes a schedule. Wake before the heat, move goods before the street thickens, bring clay while it is workable, dry bricks before weather ruins them, deliver grain before spoilage, pay what is owed before debt grows teeth, attend the ritual when the calendar says the gods are watching, appear in court when summoned, bring witnesses, bring seals, bring patience if you can afford it. The wealth of Babylon was therefore not a heap, it was movement controlled. Grain from fields into storehouses, silver by weight into payments, wool into workshops, clay into tablets, water into canals. conquered goods into palaces, foreign people into labor systems, neighborhoods, and memories. The richer the city became, the more it needed to know where everything was. A poor village can rely on faces and grudges. A great city needs archives. And Babylon had archives in the broad sense. Not one tidy modern filing cabinet, but the deep habit of recording the world. Cuneiform tablets could preserve contracts, loans, sales, adoption arrangements, temple business, astronomical observations, school exercises, royal claims, and small human worries that somehow outlasted palaces. A clay tablet is not glamorous. It does not glitter. It does something more dangerous. It survives. It lets a forgotten argument over land or debt travel farther into the future than the voice of the person who argued it. So when we enter Babylon, we should not enter only through the grand gate. We should enter through the side door where a scribe is bored, the clay is drying too quickly, a merchant is pretending his measure is fair, and someone is wondering whether the temple official will accept the delivery without complaint. This is the real beginning of urban wealth. Not splendor, but friction made manageable. And once friction becomes manageable, power starts to gather. And power, once it gathers, begins to speak in the voice of order. That is one reason Hammurabi still stands at the doorway of Babylon's story, even though the city continued long after him and became most visually famous many centuries later. He did not build the blue Ishtar Gate. He did not rule the Babylon that Greek writers later imagined as a wonder of the world. His Babylon was earlier, smaller, and less theatrically dressed. But he gave later memory something very useful: the image of a king who could turn human conflict into written order. The famous monument we call the Code of Hammurabi was carved in stone, not clay, and it presents the king receiving authority before Shamash, the sun god associated with justice. That image matters almost as much as the laws themselves. The king is not saying, "I happen to be strong, so do what I say." That would be honest, but too crude for a civilization with proper paperwork. He is saying that justice has a cosmic source, that society is not supposed to be random, that injury, debt, marriage, wages, inheritance, status, property, and punishment belong inside a pattern. Whether the text functioned exactly like a modern legal code is debated, and historians are careful with that. But as a royal statement, it is clear enough. Babylon wanted to be seen as a place where order had been captured, arranged, and made visible. The law was not just a tool, it was architecture made of sentences. And what sentences they are! They do not sound like modern ideals floating in clean air. They sound like a city full of disputes. A builder makes a bad house. A farmer neglects a field. A man borrows silver. A woman's marriage is contested. An injury is done. A contract is broken. A slave runs away. A merchant's agent mishandles goods. Again and again, the laws begin from the same human truth. People living together will absolutely find ways to cause problems. And someone has to decide what happens after the shouting. There is something comforting and slightly ridiculous in that. We often imagine ancient law as remote and grand, but much of it is painfully domestic. It is about houses that fall down, fields that flood, payments that go missing, accusations people cannot prove, and neighbours who were probably just as exhausting in 1750 BCE as they are now. Babylon did not need law because people were primitive. It needed law because people were people. Still, the comfort has edges. The world preserved in Hammurabi's laws is sharply unequal. Penalties and protections depend on status. Elite men, commoners, and enslaved people do not occupy the same legal ground. Bodies are valued differently. Harm does not mean the same thing when done to every person. The law creates order, yes, but it also tells you where you stand. It is a map of hierarchy pretending, not always falsely, to be a map of justice. That is one of the great lessons Babylon gives us early. A system can be stabilizing and unequal at the same time. It can reduce chaos while preserving power. It can protect some people from arbitrary harm while reminding others that they are counted differently. This is not a contradiction ancient people failed to notice. It is the machinery of class made official. The city gathers bodies together, then sorts them. And sorting requires records. Think of the city not from above, with walls and temples, but from the level of a small transaction. A man needs seed grain. A family needs silver. A merchant sends goods through an agent. A field changes hands. A debt must be witnessed. A marriage arrangement needs terms. A temple receives offerings. A worker receives rations. None of these moments looks especially dramatic. No one makes a movie trailer about a receipt. Yet these are the threads that hold a city in place. A scribe sits with clay. The tablet is still damp. Names are pressed into it. Amounts are fixed. Witnesses appear. Seals may be rolled. The clay dries, and suddenly, a fragile human promise has become heavier than memory. You cannot simply say later, "That was not the arrangement." At least not without discovering that the tablet has been waiting for you, with the cold patience of baked mud. The old joke is that writing began because someone needed to count sheep. It is not the whole story, but it is spiritually accurate. Before writing becomes poetry, scripture, epic, astronomy, and royal boasting, it is very good at making sure nobody quietly misplaces the sheep. Babylon inherited and expanded this older Mesopotamian genius, the ability to make the world accountable by pressing signs into clay. A city of thousands cannot run on trust alone. Trust is lovely. Trust is also hard to audit. So Babylon's richness depended on a strange kind of imagination. Not fantasy imagination, but administrative imagination. The ability to see a harvest before it arrives, a tax before it is paid, a worker as part of a labour group, a canal as a seasonal obligation, a god's meal as a scheduled delivery, a king's glory as a building project requiring bricks, timber, bitumen, metals, animals, boats, and a lot of people pretending they are thrilled to participate. The palace and temple were the great magnets. They pulled in goods, labour, and meaning. But they did not pull everything in by simple violence, even when violence stood behind the arrangement. They also used habit, obligation, belief, debt, prestige, family ties, ritual expectation, and the deep human preference for a world that at least appears organised. A city does not survive by shouting commands every hour. Eventually people must wake up already knowing where to go. That is what makes Babylon more fascinating than a treasure city. Treasure just sits there. Babylon moved. Grain moved from countryside to storehouse. Wool moved from animals to workshops. Clay moved from riverbank to tablet and wall. Silver moved by weight through accounts. Ritual objects moved through temple spaces. Divine statues moved in procession. Labourers moved to repair canals. Armies moved outward, and later, captives and tribute moved inward. The city's wealth was not one pile of shining things. It was choreography. And choreography can be beautiful from a distance and exhausting from inside it. For a poor worker, Babylon's greatness may have felt less like wonder and more like sore shoulders. For a debtor, the city's order may have sounded like someone reading obligations aloud. For a priest, it may have meant ritual precision and institutional privilege. For a king, it meant the intoxicating possibility that the world could be arranged around his name. For a merchant, it meant opportunity, risk, measures, contacts, and the perpetual suspicion that someone else's scale was dishonest in a more profitable way. This is the city beginning to reveal itself. Not yet the huge Neo-Babylonian capital with glazed lions and imperial drama, but the deeper organism underneath. Babylon becomes rich because it learns how to gather. It gathers water through canals, grain through agriculture, loyalty through religion, disputes through law, labour through obligation, memory through writing, and authority through the claim that all of this is not merely convenient, but divinely ordered. Once a city can do that, it can survive bad kings, absorb good ones, lose wars, recover, swell, shrink, and wait for another empire to discover its usefulness. Stone monuments can be carried away, clay tablets can be buried, walls can fall and be rebuilt, but the habit remains. Count the grain, stamp the brick, invoke the god, write it down. That habit is where Babylon's real wealth begins to breathe. The body learns the city before the mind understands it. You would feel Babylon first as heat, dust, and nearness. A great ancient city was not an abstract achievement. It pressed itself against you. Walls held people in, but they also held in noise, smoke, animals, cooking smells, wet clay, human impatience, and the sweet, sour breath of grain and beer. The street was not a clean line between buildings. It was a channel of movement, gossip, bargaining, waste, shade, argument, and errands. A person could cross a city and read its hierarchy without reading a single tablet, just by noticing who had space, who had shade, who had servants, who had to carry things, and who could make others wait. For most people, Babylon's wealth would not have appeared as treasure, it would have appeared as work. A woman grinding grain would know the city through the ache in her arms. A porter would know it through the strap cutting across his shoulder. A boatman would know it by the mood of the river, the depth of the channel, the weight of cargo, and the kind of official who could delay him at the worst possible moment. A child might know it by the smell of bread, the slap of sandals, the glitter of temple objects glimpsed from a distance, and the rule that some doors were not for people like them. The city was full of thresholds, house doorways, courtyard entrances, temple gates, palace walls, market spaces, workshop corners, canal banks, inner districts, outer districts. Every threshold asked a question. Who are you? What do you owe? Who sent you? Are you allowed here? The richer Babylon became, the more carefully some spaces were guarded. Wealth does not merely buy objects, it buys distance. It buys the right not to be jostled. It buys a courtyard where the street cannot stare at you. A typical house, depending heavily on period, class, and neighbourhood, might turn inward around a courtyard. That inwardness mattered. The street could be loud and public. The house tried to create a smaller world where family, storage, cooking, sleeping, work, and reputation could be managed. Privacy, though, was not privacy in the modern sense. Walls were thinner than secrets. Families were larger and more entangled. Servants, enslaved people, relatives, clients, visitors, and neighbours could move through domestic life in ways that made the household less like a private retreat and more like a small institution with a roof. The courtyard was a kind of lung. Light fell there, air moved there when it felt generous. Food could be prepared, children could be watched, textiles could be handled, tools could be stored, conversations could happen under the partial protection of home. But home was still part of the city's system. Marriage contracts, inheritance disputes, debts, dowries, adoptions, sales, rentals, and obligations could all pull the household into the world of tablets and witnesses. Even affection, when it lived inside property, had paperwork standing nearby with a stylus. That does not mean people were cold, it means the city had a way of putting clay around tenderness. Food makes this easier to feel. Babylonian daily eating varied by class and century, of course, but the staples of southern Mesopotamia were not mysterious. Barley, bread, beer, dates, onions, legumes, oils, dairy, fish, and meat when status or occasion allowed. Beer was not merely a party beverage, it was part of ordinary nourishment, wages, offerings, and social life. Bread and beer together tell you something profound about the city. Grain became food through labour. Grain became payment through administration. Grain became temple offering through ritual. Grain became debt through accounting. One crop could pass through the stomach, the archive, the shrine, and the court. Imagine a market morning. The air is already warming. Someone has dates, someone has fish, someone is selling oil, someone is complaining that the measure is light, because ancient commerce was apparently invented alongside ancient suspicion. Donkeys push through, baskets scrape. A merchant's assistant tries to look more confident than he feels. A scribe may be needed for a larger deal. Small transactions happen by habit and trust. Larger ones need witnesses, seals, weights, and the calm terror of written memory. There is a particular kind of anxiety that belongs to measured societies. Once weights and contracts enter daily life, unfairness becomes more precise. You are not just cheated in a vague way, you are cheated by a known amount, which is somehow more insulting. The city promises order, and because it promises order, people become experts at noticing when order has leaned slightly in someone else's favour. The workshops added another rhythm. Textile production, metalwork, pottery, carpentry, brewing, baking, brickmaking, boatwork, and countless smaller trades kept the urban body moving. Some labour was skilled and respected, some was compulsory, low status, enslaved, or exhausting. Many tasks left marks on the body: cracked hands, bent backs, smoke-stung eyes, cuts, burns, calluses, dust in the throat. Great cities love to display finished surfaces. They are much quieter about the bodies that made the surfaces smooth. And then there were the sounds. Animals, wheels, feet, water, vendors, temple activity, domestic quarrels, children, tools, the scratch of a reed stylus, the slap of wet clay, the dull impact of bricks being stacked, the call of someone who has been waiting too long in a line and is beginning to discover political philosophy. Babylon was not a silent place. Even ritual silence would have been framed by noise. When a procession moved, when a festival filled the city, when divine statues were carried, when priests and officials performed the choreography of sacred power, the ordinary streets were transformed into a stage where everyone could see the city telling itself what it was. The Processional Way in the Neo-Babylonian period gives us the grandest version of that transformation. Under Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon's ceremonial spaces became part of an imperial language of colour, animals, gods, and controlled movement. The Ishtar Gate, built in the 6th century BCE, was decorated with glazed brick reliefs of bulls and dragons, while the Processional Way was lined with striding lions, images tied to divine and royal symbolism. But for the person sweeping a floor after the celebration, persuasion still left dust. That is the doubleness of Babylon's daily life. The same city could be sacred and inconvenient, magnificent and sweaty, ordered and unfair, full of gods and full of flies. A place where royal inscriptions promised eternal splendour, while ordinary people worried about prices, illness, family reputation, late deliveries, bad harvests, and whether the official across from them was in a merciful mood. This is why the richest city is never only rich. It is crowded with negotiations. Every shining surface depends on dull repetition. Every ritual depends on someone preparing food, cleaning space, moving objects, and knowing when to step aside. Every palace depends on workshops. Every temple depends on fields. Every archive depends on hands pressing signs into clay. Every blue brick depends first on mud. And the mud does not care how famous the city becomes. The same order that protects a city also teaches everyone their size. Babylonian society was not one crowd moving through one shared world. It was a stack of worlds laid carefully on top of each other, and a person felt that stacking in the smallest parts of life, where they stood, what they wore, how they spoke, whose name mattered in a contract, whose injury drew compensation, whose word needed support, whose body could be bought, pledged, punished, or moved. The city gathered people, but gathering is not the same thing as equality. A basket of dates may hold many fruits. Someone still owns the basket. This is where the law becomes more than a set of rules. It becomes a mirror, and not always a kind one. In the legal traditions associated with Hammurabi's Babylon, penalties and protections varied according to status, circumstance, and relationship. The collection includes matters of trade, wages, theft, property, debt, family, injury, and slavery. But it does not imagine all people standing in one flat moral field. It sorts them. The free elite man, the common dependent person, and the enslaved person were not treated as interchangeable legal beings. That distinction is not a footnote. It is one of the bones of the system. The city could promise justice while quietly asking, justice for whom, and at what price? A modern listener may want to call that hypocrisy, And it is tempting. But hypocrisy is too simple. Babylonian order was built inside hierarchy, not accidentally stained by it. Status was not a flaw in the wallpaper, it was part of the architecture. If someone injured a high-status man, the consequence might be framed one way. If the injured person had lower status, compensation might be different. If an enslaved person was involved, the law's language could shift again. Because the system saw persons and property crossing in ways that are deeply uncomfortable to us and were ordinary to them. That discomfort matters. It keeps the city from becoming a theme park. Enslavement in Babylonia was not identical in every period or household, and evidence varies. People could become enslaved through war, birth, debt, purchase, or other dependency arrangements. Some enslaved people worked in households, temples, estates, or economic institutions. Some could possess limited property or conduct transactions in certain contexts, depending on period and situation, but none of that should be softened into freedom. A person who can be bought and sold is living under a violence that has learned to use calm language. The tablet may be neat, the condition is not. Debt was another doorway through which the city entered the body. Debt sounds abstract until you imagine the face of someone who has watched the harvest fail. A loan is not just silver or grain, it is time pulled forward with a hook in it. In a good year, it may save a household. In a bad year, it can begin to eat the household from inside. Fields, labour, family members, future harvests and reputation could all become entangled in obligation. Babylon's paperwork did not create human vulnerability, but it made vulnerability recordable, and once recorded, it could travel from one room to another with official confidence. There is a darkly funny little cruelty in bureaucracy. It gives suffering good handwriting. Women's lives also sat inside this world of contract, household, family strategy, and legal protection mixed with control. The evidence for Mesopotamian women is richer than many people expect, especially through family archives, letters, contracts, and law collections. But it is uneven and often preserved through institutions run by men. Women could appear in documents connected to marriage, dowry, property, inheritance, business, priestly roles, debt, divorce, and household management. Some elite or economically active women had room to maneuver. Some owned property or participated in transactions. But marriage and family reputation placed heavy pressure on many women's lives, and the law often treated female sexuality, fertility, and household position as matters of family order rather than private selfhood. A marriage, in this world, was not only a romance, it was a transfer of expectations. It could involve gifts, dowry, negotiations, family alliances, future children, labour, inheritance, and status. A bride did not simply walk into a house carrying feelings. She entered a structure already crowded with property, kinship, law, and the anxious hopes of people who wanted their descendants, fields, and goods to behave properly after they were dead. Love may have lived there. Tenderness may have lived there. Jokes, patience, annoyance, and real attachment may have lived there. But the household also had ledgers, witnesses, and consequences. That is why we have to be careful not to make ancient people either colder or freer than they were. They were not legal robots. They did not wake up each morning as examples in a textbook. They worried, desired, resented, forgave, schemed, mourned, laughed, and tried to get through the day. But their emotional lives moved through systems that did not ask modern questions. A daughter could be loved and still negotiated over. A wife could be respected and still constrained. An enslaved woman could be essential to a household and still denied the basic safety of belonging to herself. A poor man could be legally free and still trapped by debt so tightly that freedom began to feel like a technicality with sandals. The city did not need to shout these truths, it arranged them. You could see it in seating, clothing, diet, names, seals, witnesses, access to officials, and the ability to make other people wait. Power is often most visible in delay. The important person is not the one standing in the sun. The important person is the one inside, while others invent patience outside the door. In Babylon, as in so many cities after it, hierarchy had a temperature. Some people got shade. Law courts and formal disputes reveal the city's faith in procedure, but procedure did not erase inequality. Witnesses mattered. Documents mattered. Oaths mattered. Reputation mattered. Gender and status mattered. A person with family backing, property, and recognized standing entered a dispute differently from someone poor, foreign, enslaved, or socially exposed. The city gave people methods for resolving conflict, and that was no small thing. But methods are never neutral when people arrive with unequal weight. This may be one of Babylon's most important lessons. Civilization does not replace force. It teaches force to sit behind a desk. That sounds harsh, and it should. But it is also not the whole picture. The same systems that constrained people could sometimes protect them. A written contract could preserve a woman's dowry claim. A court process could establish responsibility. A wage rate could create expectation. A recorded sale could prevent later denial. A legal penalty could restrain private revenge. Order was not fake simply because it was unequal. It was useful, sometimes genuinely so. The tragedy is that usefulness and unfairness can share the same tablet. This is how Babylon's richness moved through bodies, not only through kings and temples, but through the daily grammar of rank. Who owes? Who signs? Who witnesses? Who inherits? Who eats first? Who can leave? Who can be taken? Who speaks for whom? Who is counted as a person in one sentence and as someone's asset in the next? A city becomes powerful when these questions have answers before anyone asks them. And Babylon, with its clay tablets, temple households, royal claims, family contracts, labour obligations, and legal imagination, became very powerful indeed. It did not only gather wealth from fields and trade, it gathered people into categories and then made those categories feel like the natural shape of the world. That is the quiet pressure inside the grand story. Before Babylon could look eternal, it had to teach ordinary life where to stand. The hidden rule was that nothing stayed private once it could be measured. That sounds too sharp at first, because Babylon was still full of intimate, unrecorded life. People whispered, children misbehaved, lovers made promises no scribe heard, workers complained in ways that never reached clay, families carried griefs too ordinary for archives. But the deeper a city grows, the more it reaches into moments that once belonged only to memory. A field boundary, a marriage gift, a debt, a wage, a delivery, a sale, a temple ration, a slave purchase, a lease, a witness statement, a royal building inscription. All of these could be pressed into clay and made to outlast the living. This was not only record keeping, it was a way of making reality behave. A clay tablet has a strange authority because it is both humble and stubborn. It can be small enough to hold in your hand, yet strong enough to make a person afraid. While wet, it accepts the reed stylus quietly. Once dried or fired, it becomes a kind of little wall. Not a wall around the city, but a wall around a version of events. This person owes this amount. This land changed hands. This witness was present. This measure was delivered. This name belongs here. The tablet says, in its dry and patient way, you may remember differently, but I have been waiting. And that is where Babylon's wealth begins to feel almost modern. The city did not merely own things, it owned procedures for proving things. That is a different kind of richness. A man with grain is lucky for a season. A palace with an archive knows who owes grain next season. A temple with scribes can turn offerings, land, workers and rents into continuity. A merchant with records can send goods beyond the reach of his own eyes. A king with inscriptions can force later generations to meet him in the brickwork. Writing stretches power. It lets an order travel farther than a voice, farther than a hand, sometimes farther than the army that first made the order possible. This is not romantic, but it is astonishing. Imagine a boat arriving near Babylon with goods from upstream or from connected trade networks. The river has carried more than cargo, it has carried risk. Reeds, wood, metals, stones, textiles, animals, grain, and luxury objects all move through chains of trust and suspicion. Someone has paid, someone has promised, someone has guaranteed, someone has taken a share. Someone will claim loss if the cargo arrives damaged. Behind every boat is a little cloud of obligations. The city's job is to turn that cloud into entries, witnesses, measures, and consequences. If the river is the artery, the archive is the nervous system. This is scribes mattered so deeply. They were not merely people who could write. They were translators between life and institution. They turned noise into categories. They turned quarrels into cases. They turned grain into numbers. They turned temple service into schedules. Their training was difficult, and their position could offer status, though not all scribes were equally grand. A school exercise scratched into clay may look dry to us, but it belonged to a world where literacy opened doors that muscle alone could not. The person who can make the mark can make the record. The person who makes the record helps decide what the city remembers. And what the city remembers, it can demand. Of course, the tablet did not float above power like a pure little angel of truth. Records served people and institutions strong enough to use them. A poor debtor could be trapped by a document as easily as protected by one. An enslaved person could appear in a tablet as property changing hands, which is one of the coldest ways the past can speak. A woman's dowry might be preserved in writing, but the same documentary culture could also tighten family control. Written order does not automatically mean justice. Sometimes it means unfairness has learned to keep receipts. There is the quiet Babylonian horror, not chaos, but tidy domination. Yet chaos was no friend either. In a city without durable memory, the strong can deny everything. The stronger voice wins. The bigger family wins. The man with more followers wins. Records could restrain that, at least sometimes. They could give shape to obligations and make agreements more difficult to erase. That is why Babylon cannot be reduced to a simple, villainous machine. Its systems were oppressive in some directions and protective in others. They made life heavier, but also more predictable. They trapped people, and sometimes they saved them from being swallowed by someone else's convenient forgetfulness. Babylon lived inside that tension. The same tension appears in its religion. The gods were not outside the administrative world, they were woven into it. Marduk's temple, the Esagila, was not only sacred architecture, it was part of the city's claim to cosmic centrality. The god's cult required offerings, personnel, storage, scheduling, lands, and ritual precision. To serve a god in a city like Babylon was not only to feel devotion, it was to move goods correctly. It was to prepare food, maintain objects, observe calendars, and support ceremonies that told the population that the world still had a centre. A festival could therefore do something an archive could not. It made order visible. When the Akitu festival returned with the new year, the city's theology and politics stepped into public space. The king's authority could be ritually tested, humbled, renewed, and tied again to divine favour. The god moved, the people watched, the city remembered its own importance. In that moment, Babylon was not merely administering wealth, it was performing the reason wealth should gather there at all. Other cities had gods, other cities had temples. Babylon claimed that its god, its ritual, its king, and its walls belonged to the structure of reality. That is a very powerful thing to believe about your tax base. The humour is easy, but the belief was serious. A city's survival depends on more than canals and soldiers. It needs a story large enough to make obedience feel meaningful. People will repair a wall because they are ordered to. They will repair it longer, harder, and with less visible resentment if the wall belongs to a sacred city whose God protects the world from disorder. This does not mean everyone believed with the same intensity. Ancient cities contained skeptics, opportunists, tired workers, devout priests, ambitious officials, and people who simply wanted the day to end. But the public story mattered. It wrapped labour in cosmic cloth. The result was a city where mud became brick, brick became wall, wall became symbol, Symbol became obedience, obedience became wealth, and wealth became proof that the symbol had been true all along. This loop is one of the oldest tricks of power. Success makes authority look natural. If Babylon grows, Marduk must be great. If Marduk is great, Babylon should grow. If the king rebuilds the temple, the gods favour him. If the gods favour him, his building projects become sacred duty. Round and round it goes, as smooth as a seal rolling across damp clay. And there, in that circular motion, Babylon begins to look less like a place and more like a machine for turning belief into administration and administration back into belief. The city measured the world, but it also enchanted the measuring. A ration was not just a ration if it belonged to temple service. A brick was not just a brick if it carried the king's name. A street was not just a street if the god passed along it. A wall was not just a wall if it proved the city's chosen status. The secret was never simply that Babylon was rich. The secret was that Babylon learned how to make richness look inevitable. And inevitability, once a city believes in it too deeply, begins to attract enemies. Babylon's greatness was never a straight climb. That is another modern illusion worth letting go. We like famous cities to rise, shine, fall, and become ruins in a clean arc, as if history were a candle burning down in one elegant motion. Babylon's story is messier and more human than that. It rose, was conquered, recovered, was humiliated, became useful to stronger powers, rebelled, was punished, was rebuilt, and then rose again with almost theatrical confidence. The city did not simply become rich and stay rich. It became valuable enough that other kings wanted to own it. That is the danger of becoming a centre. Everyone can see you. For centuries after Hammurabi, Babylon remained important, but its political fortunes shifted. Dynasties changed, foreign powers entered. Kassite kings ruled Babylonia for a long period. Later, Assyrian power pressed down from the north with the kind of imperial intensity that makes every local king suddenly very interested in diplomacy. Assyria was not a vague shadow in Babylon's story. It was a hard, organised military empire with its own cities, gods, kings, scribes, cruelty, ambition, and sense of destiny. Babylon, holy and prestigious, became both prize and problem, too valuable to ignore, too proud to handle gently. This is one of the strange features of sacred cities. Conquering them gives you legitimacy, but damaging them can make you look like you have insulted the universe. Assyrian kings wrestled with that problem. Sometimes they honoured Babylon, sometimes they controlled it through client rulers. Sometimes they took the title of King of Babylon themselves, and sometimes the relationship turned brutal. The most notorious moment came in 689 BCE, when the Assyrian king Sennacherib destroyed Babylon after rebellion. Ancient royal inscriptions frame such acts in the language of overwhelming victory, because kings rarely wrote, "I may have overreacted." The destruction shocked later memory precisely because Babylon was not just another captured town. It was the city of Marduk, the city of scholarship and ritual prestige, the city that claimed a central place in the world's order. To attack it was not only to break walls, it was to break meaning. But meaning has a way of surviving bad architecture. Sennacherib's successors had to deal with the consequences. Esarhaddon, his son, reversed course and rebuilt Babylon, presenting himself not simply as a conqueror, but as restorer. That shift tells us a great deal. Babylon's religious prestige was too powerful to leave in ruins without cost. Empires can smash cities. They cannot always smash the need for those cities to exist. If a city has become a symbol of order, destroying it creates an awkward question. What kind of king destroys order? So Babylon returned. Not magically, not poetically, with labour, with bricks, with calculations, with workers hauling materials and officials organising restoration, with royal inscriptions explaining why the rebuilding was righteous. Ruin became a political problem, and rebuilding became political theatre. The city was not only repaired, the meaning of the repair was carefully staged. A restored Babylon could prove that the king was favoured, wise, pious, and powerful enough to put the broken world back into shape. Once again, brick became argument. Then Assyria itself began to crack. By the late 7th century BCE, the Assyrian Empire faced internal strain and external enemies. Babylonian resistance, led by Nabopolassar, joined with the Medes and others in the collapse of Assyrian power. Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, a date with a heavy sound in the ancient Near East. For Babylon, this was not merely revenge, it was opening. A city that had long been controlled, punished, rebuilt, and symbolically used by others, now became the heart of a new empire. The Neo-Babylonian kingdom rose from the ruins of Assyria's dominance, and Babylon prepared to wear greatness in its most famous costume. This is where Nebuchadnezzar II enters, and with him the Babylon many people picture first. He ruled from 605 to 562 BCE, and his reign turned Babylon into an imperial capital whose ruins would later feed imagination for millennia. He inherited power from Nabopolassar and expanded Babylonian strength through war, diplomacy, administration, and building. His campaigns in the west brought Judah into Babylon's imperial world, including the capture of Jerusalem and deportations that would become central to Jewish historical and religious memory. Here the city's beauty and its violence meet in the same frame. For one person, Babylon was a marvel of gates and walls. For another, it was the place to which home had been dragged in chains. That is why we cannot describe Babylon's splendor as if it were morally weightless. Imperial wealth is never just wealth. It has roots. It has origins. It has names it tries to forget. Tribute came in. Labor was commanded. Skilled people were moved. Precious materials traveled through systems of pressure. Foreign elites and communities could be deported, not randomly, but as part of imperial strategy, to weaken rebellious regions, supply labor, integrate populations, and make resistance harder to organize. The city that astonished visitors was also a destination for people who had not chosen the journey. And yet, those people did not vanish into symbolism. They lived. They adapted. They remembered. Exiled communities could preserve identity, law, worship, language, grievance, and hope under imperial conditions. Babylon could force movement, but it could not fully control memory. That is one reason the later image of Babylon became so powerful in biblical tradition. It was not only a place of buildings, it was the name of displacement. The city became what empire felt like when viewed from the captive side of the road. Meanwhile, inside Babylon, building continued. Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions speak with royal confidence about temples, walls, palaces, and processional spaces. Kings loved building because building made authority visible. A military victory happens elsewhere and must be narrated. A wall stands in front of everyone. A gate controls movement every day. A temple rebuilt by the king lets the god's glory and the king's glory lean comfortably against each other. A palace says, "Power sleeps here, and probably on better bedding than you." The Ishtar Gate and the Processional Way belong to this world of display. Glazed bricks, deep blue surfaces, striding lions, dragons and bulls turned movement through the city into a lesson in divine and royal order. The animals were not cute decorations, though after enough museum gift shops anything can become dangerously close to cute. They were symbols tied to gods, kingship, protection, and controlled awe. To walk through such a space was to be instructed by colour and scale before anyone spoke. Babylon was staging itself. But staging is not false simply because it is staged. That is important. The city really was impressive. Its ceremonial architecture really did shape experience. Its temples and walls really did express enormous resources and technical skill. The point is not to sneer at grandeur. The point is to notice what grandeur is doing. Babylon's rebuilt splendour after Assyrian domination was a statement. We were broken, and now we are the centre again. Every brick declared recovery. Every gate turned survival into performance. Every ritual reminded the population that history itself had bent back toward Babylon. And for a while, the performance worked. Merchants, officials, priests, soldiers, deported communities, craftsmen, labourers, and scribes all moved inside this imperial city, each encountering a different Babylon. The king's Babylon was eternal. The priest's Babylon was sacred. The merchant's Babylon was opportunity. The captive's Babylon was exile. The worker's Babylon was weight. The scribe's Babylon was entries and names. The god's Babylon, if we follow the city's own imagination, was the chosen dwelling of order. All these Babylons existed at once. That is what makes the city so hard to hold in one sentence. It was not only rich, not only cruel, not only brilliant, not only sacred, not only bureaucratic, not only mythic. It was the place where all of those things had to share streets. The same processional way that displayed divine majesty also needed cleaning. The same palace that projected permanence required constant supply. The same empire that boasted of order created grief in the lands it conquered. The same bricks that made Babylon beautiful were carried by human hands. And the hands are always the part empire hopes you do not notice for too long. By the time the Blue Gate rises in the imagination, Babylon has already become more than a city people live in. It has become a room the world walks through. That is the middle turn in the story. Up to this point, Babylon has been mud, law, canal, archive, temple, hierarchy, labour, conquest, rebuilding, and display. Now it becomes something stranger, a place so carefully staged that even people who never saw it began to inherit an image of it. This is when architecture stops being only architecture and starts becoming memory's raw material. The Ishtar Gate is useful here because it gives the mind something solid to touch, not because it tells the whole truth of Babylon, but because it shows how the city wanted to be encountered. Imagine approaching ceremonial Babylon during the Neo-Babylonian period, not as a modern tourist with a camera and comfortable shoes, but as a person whose body already understands rank. The walls are not just high, they change your posture. The gate is not just coloured, it arrests your eyes. The lions, dragons and bulls are not only beautiful, they tell you that divine forces, royal authority and urban power have formed a single surface, and you are small in front of it. That smallness was part of the design. Great ancient architecture often worked by changing the body first. It did not need you to understand every symbol. It needed you to slow down, look up, and feel that something larger than you had organized the space. A poor worker, a foreign envoy, a priest, a soldier, a merchant, and a captive might interpret the gate differently, but all of them had to pass through the same argument made in brick. Babylon was telling them, this city is not accidental. This city has a cosmic address. And yet the gate was still made of pieces. That is the useful antidote to awe. Glazed brick by glazed brick, relief by relief, row by row, the famous surface was assembled from work. Colour required materials and firing. Images required planning. Walls required foundations. Processional space required maintenance. The finished gate says eternity. The making of the gate says scheduling. Somewhere behind the sacred blue, someone had to solve ordinary problems. Fuel, clay, transport, labour, measurement, breakage, delay. And the ancient contractor's timeless gift to civilization. The problem that is somehow everyone else's fault. This is how Babylon renews itself in the middle of the story. It is not merely that the city becomes grander, it becomes better at hiding the effort inside the effect. The Processional Way did something similar. It turned movement into meaning. During festival time, especially in rituals tied to Marduk and the New Year, the city's sacred geography became active. Statues, priests, king, people, gates, streets, temples, and timing all worked together. A ritual procession is not only a religious event, it is a moving diagram of power. Everyone can see who walks, who watches, who carries, who clears the way, who is allowed near the divine image, who remains at the edge, and who controls the route. The city becomes a theatre, but not in the shallow sense. Theatre here does not mean fake. It means arranged reality. It means a truth made visible through costume, sound, movement, and repeated gesture. Babylon's festivals did not simply entertain the population. They taught the city how to imagine itself. They reassured people that the gods still received their offerings, that the king still had a role in cosmic order, that the temples still mattered, that the calendar had not broken, that chaos had once again been pushed to the edges. Cities need rituals because administration alone is too dry to love. Nobody lies awake comforted by the thought that the grain records are mostly current. Well, perhaps one scribe did, and we should wish him peace. But most people need more than accounts. They need festivals, stories, colours, music, food, sacred movement, and public moments when the world appears to have a shape. Babylon's genius was that it joined these things together. The same city that counted rations also performed cosmic renewal. The same institutions that stored barley served gods. The same king who commanded labour humbled himself ritually before divine power, then emerged strengthened by the performance of humility. There is a sharp little irony there. A king can be humbled in public only when everyone agrees he is important enough for his humiliation to matter. That kind of ritual humility was not the same as ordinary weakness. It was controlled vulnerability. It showed that the king stood beneath the gods, yes, but also that he was the one chosen to stand there on behalf of everyone else. The ritual did not erase hierarchy, it polished it. It made royal power look obedient to heaven rather than merely hungry on earth. And Babylon knew hunger very well. Not hunger only in the stomach, though that was real enough in bad years. Hunger in the institutional sense. The palace hungered for tribute. The temple hungered for offerings, the archive hungered for names, the army hungered for supplies, the building program hungered for bricks, the city hungered for people, workers, specialists, priests, scribes, merchants, soldiers, captives, families, children who would grow into the next generation of hands. A great city is never done eating. It eats grain, time, labour, loyalty and memory. Then it calls the meal civilization. That may sound harsh, but it is also why Babylon could become magnificent. Small communities can be intimate, but they cannot easily produce a ceremonial gate that later fragments itself across museums and textbooks. They cannot gather scribal scholarship at such scale. They cannot stage rituals that echo through empires. They cannot turn a local god into a cosmic monarch without institutions to carry the claim. Babylon's appetite made it dangerous, but it also made it generative. It produced knowledge, beauty, administration, theology, astronomy, mathematics, literature, and urban forms of life that outlasted the kings who boasted over them. This is where the viewer's first picture of Babylon should begin to change. The city is not a simple warning against luxury. It is not merely a monument to arrogance. It is not only a victim of time. It is what happens when human beings discover that scale itself has power. More people mean more labour, more specialisation, more records, more gods served with greater ceremony, more goods moved through more hands, more danger, more splendour, more inequality, more memory. Scale thickens everything. In a village, a debt may be remembered by a few families. In Babylon, it may be entered into a system. In a village, a shrine may hold local devotion. In Babylon, a temple can become an economic and political actor. In a village, a leader may display generosity. In Babylon, a king can rebuild a gate and make generosity look like cosmic destiny. In a village, a story may be told beside a doorway. In Babylon, a story can become part of imperial identity and later pass into the sacred texts and moral imaginations of people far beyond the Euphrates. This is the moment Babylon becomes portable. Not physically, of course. The city remains clay, wall, canal, street, and heat. But its image begins to travel. Merchants carry impressions. Captives carry grief. Diplomats carry awe. Scribes carry texts. Priests carry ritual memory. Enemies carry resentment. Later writers carry fragments, exaggerations, condemnations, and wonder. Babylon becomes a name that can be used after the city itself has changed. It becomes a shorthand for empire, wealth, exile, arrogance, confusion, beauty, and doom. A real city can only stand in one place. A symbolic city can appear anywhere. That is the renewal point. Babylon's greatest power may not have been that it gathered the world's wealth, but that it taught the world how to imagine wealth gathered. The walls were impressive, but the idea of the walls travelled farther. The gate was magnificent, but the memory of the gate outlived its function. The rituals ended each year, then returned, then ended again, while the belief that Babylon mattered kept moving through languages, conquerors, scriptures, histories, excavations, and dreams. Still, under all that movement, the brick remains. A brick is small, almost embarrassingly plain when separated from the wall, but Babylon's secret is hidden there. One brick alone cannot awe anyone. One brick cannot host a god, frighten an envoy, mark a procession, store grain, or claim eternity. But enough bricks, made by enough hands, arranged under enough pressure, named by enough kings, and remembered by enough strangers, can become a city that refuses to stay only itself. Babylon's richness was not just in what it possessed. It was in what it made people believe possession could become. The deeper contradiction is that Babylon became most unforgettable when it was most vulnerable to being misunderstood. Its splendour invited moral judgment. That is what happens when a city grows large enough to offend the imagination. Small places may be poor, cruel, generous, dull, holy, hungry, funny, and strange without becoming symbols of human arrogance. But when a city builds huge walls, stages godly processions, gathers captives, stores wealth, commands scribes, feeds temples, and covers a gate in blue glazed animals, people begin to suspect it must mean something. No one lets a city that impressive remain merely practical. Babylon was too useful as an idea. To its own kings, it could mean divine favour, restored order, imperial confidence, and the proper centre of the world. To deported communities, including Judeans taken after Babylonian campaigns in the Levant, it could mean exile, grief, and the humiliation of being forced to live under the power that had broken home. To Persian conquerors, it became a prize so prestigious that taking it had to be described not simply as conquest, but as restoration. To later Greek writers, it became a city of wonders, measurements, walls, gardens, and stories too large to keep tidy. To later religious imagination, it could become the name of pride, confusion, corruption, and judgment. One city, many uses. The people inside it did not live in all those meanings at once. A baker did not wake up as a theological symbol. A scribe correcting a student's exercise did not pause to think, "Today I participate in the future metaphor of empire." A woman negotiating household obligations was not trying to become part of a later sermon. Most people were living in the immediate tense: food, work, debt, family, worship, weather, gossip, illness, wages, repairs, deliveries, and the long human project of getting through the day without attracting the attention of someone more powerful. But empires do not only rule the present, they leave behind words that rule the imagination. The Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar II was real enough. His reign in the 6th century BCE was associated with military power, major building projects, and the splendour of Babylon as capital. The Ishtar Gate and Processional Way belong to this Neo-Babylonian world of monumental display. The Processional Way led through the Ishtar Gate toward the New Year festival house, and the gate itself was decorated with bulls and dragons linked to divine symbolism, while the roadway was lined with glazed lions. Those details matter because they show Babylon speaking in a visual language of sacred authority and imperial confidence. It was not just large, it was legible as power. Yet the same period also carries the memory of conquest. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was the city of walls and worship, but also the city connected to campaigns in the West and the Babylonian captivity remembered in Jewish tradition. That does not make every brick guilty, and it does not mean ordinary Babylonians were walking around as villains in someone else's scripture. History is rarely that clean. It means the city's magnificence and its violence were not separate stories. They were funded by the same imperial world, protected by the same army, praised by the same royal voice, and preserved in memories that did not agree on what the city meant. This is where Babylon becomes morally difficult in the most interesting way. It was not a cartoon of evil. It was not a cartoon of enlightenment. It was a working ancient metropolis whose institutions could produce scholarship, ritual beauty, legal order, astronomical observation, architecture, trade, and administrative sophistication, while also depending on hierarchy, forced labor, war, deportation, debt, and extraction. The same city could preserve knowledge and break families. The same king could restore temples and destroy enemies. The same walls could protect inhabitants and intimidate captives. The same procession could renew cosmic order for one viewer and deepen homesickness for another. A city can be sacred and still be someone's punishment. That line sits heavily over Babylon because its later reputation often becomes too simple. In some traditions, Babylon is the wicked city, the place of pride, the place that must fall. In others, it is a wonder, a marvel of ancient engineering and wealth. In museum rooms, it becomes fragments of glazed brick, carefully lit and politely labelled. In school books, it becomes Hammurabi, Nebuchadnezzar, gardens, gates, conquest and collapse. Each version contains something, but none contains the whole city. The real Babylon keeps escaping. It escapes because the evidence itself is uneven. Royal inscriptions praise kings because that is their job. Chronicles record events, but not every feeling under them. Administrative tablets preserve transactions with astonishing dryness. Later Greek accounts can be fascinated, exaggerated, or second-hand. Biblical texts remember Babylon through trauma, theology, and moral meaning. Archaeology gives walls, tablets, foundations, gates, plans, fragments, and objects, but not the full smell of a festival morning, or the private thoughts of the person carrying bricks in the heat. Every source opens a door and closes another. That is why caution is not a weakness here. It is the only honest way to walk through the city. Take the Hanging Gardens, for example, because they hover over Babylon like a beautiful rumour, with excellent public relations. Ancient Greek and Roman writers described them as one of the wonders of the world, often connecting them with Babylon and sometimes with Nebuchadnezzar. The familiar story says they were built for a homesick queen who missed mountain greenery. It is a wonderful image: terraces, irrigation, shade, desire turned into architecture. It is also not securely proven by Babylonian evidence. Some scholars have questioned whether the gardens were in Babylon at all, whether the story grew from confusion with Assyrian Nineveh, or whether later writers reshaped older reports into a cleaner wonder. The popular version is graceful, the evidence is less obedient. And there is something perfectly Babylonian about that. Even the garden may be an archive problem. The uncertainty does not ruin the story, it improves it. It reminds us that ancient fame is not the same thing as ancient fact. A city as famous as Babylon attracts embellishment the way wet clay attracts fingerprints. Later people pressed their needs into it. They needed a wonder city, so Babylon grew gardens. They needed a wicked empire, so Babylon became moral warning. They needed an origin of confusion, so the tower story attached itself to the plain of Shinar and the image of human pride reaching upward. They needed proof that great cities fall, so Babylon's ruins became a sermon with bricks. But before the sermon, there was the city. And before the city became a symbol, there were households with courtyards, priests with schedules, scribes with clay, boatmen with cargo, children with dust on their feet, women managing property and reputation, merchants watching waits, enslaved people living under ownership, soldiers returning with stories they may or may not have wanted, deportees learning the streets of a place they had not chosen, and officials making order out of everyone else's vulnerability. The contradiction is not that Babylon was rich and then later called wicked. The contradiction is that its richness made judgment almost inevitable. Once wealth becomes visible enough, people ask what it cost. Once power becomes beautiful enough, people ask whom beauty served. Once a city claims eternity, every crack becomes meaningful. Babylon taught the world how a city could look permanent. Then it taught the world how permanence becomes a story people tell after the walls begin to fail. The hidden cost begins to show most clearly when Babylon is no longer the one doing all the conquering. There is a special humiliation reserved for great cities when another empire walks in and decides to explain them to themselves. Babylon had done this to others. It had taken people, tribute, symbols, labour and memory, then arranged them inside its own story. But in 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great of Persia took Babylon from Nabonidus, the last Neo-Babylonian king, and the city entered a new imperial grammar. The Persian conquest did not erase Babylon overnight. That would be too simple. And history rarely gives us the courtesy of clean endings. Babylon remained wealthy, famous, sacred, and administratively useful. But something had changed. The city that had taught others the language of imperial order now had to hear that language spoken with a Persian accent. The sources around Cyrus are fascinating because they show conquest trying very hard not to look like conquest. The Cyrus cylinder, written in Babylonian cuneiform after the Persian takeover, presents Cyrus as a legitimate ruler who respected Babylon's traditions, restored cults, and corrected the failures of Nabonidus. It is one of those ancient documents that sounds generous, until you remember that generosity is often how successful power introduces itself. The text belongs to a long Mesopotamian tradition of royal self-presentation. The bad previous king failed the gods. The new king arrived with divine favour, order was restored, temples were respected, and everyone could please stop being difficult. Cyrus did not simply defeat Babylon. In the official story, he healed it. That does not mean the document is useless. It means it is doing work. A royal inscription is never a diary. It does not sit quietly in the corner saying, "Here are my mixed feelings." It makes a case. The cylinder tells us that Cyrus and his administration understood something essential about Babylon. You could not rule the city well by treating it as just another captured prize. Babylon had old prestige, old gods, old scholars, old rituals, old administrative habits, and a dangerous talent for remembering insult. If you wanted Babylon, you needed more than soldiers. You needed to stand inside Babylonian tradition and make it say your name without choking. So Cyrus borrowed the costume of local legitimacy. This is one of the more subtle costs of greatness. A famous city can survive conquest, but only by becoming useful to the conqueror. Babylon's prestige protected it, but prestige is not freedom. The Persian king could honour Marduk, respect the temples, maintain administrative functions, and still own the political future. The city could keep its rituals, but its independence was gone. It could remain magnificent, but magnificence now served a larger empire whose centre of gravity lay elsewhere. That is a quieter tragedy than flames. There is no single dramatic collapse, no neat moment when the last blue brick falls and everyone understands the age has ended. Instead, Babylon continues. Officials work, temples function, merchants trade, families marry, inherit, borrow, argue, and bury their dead. Scribes still press signs into clay. Priests still worry about correct performance. The river still has to be managed. People still wake up with ordinary needs. But the city is no longer the main author of its own importance. It has become a chapter in someone else's imperial book. And because Babylon had been so good at making power look sacred, its conquerors could use the same method. That is the uncomfortable brilliance of imperial systems. They do not always destroy what came before. Sometimes they keep it alive, because it is too valuable to waste. A temple can become a bridge. An archive can become an instrument. A local elite can become a collaborator, a mediator, or a survivor, depending on the angle from which history is staring. A festival can continue, but now it also helps stabilize a new order. The god remains in the city. The tax route has changed. The ordinary person might notice this in layers rather than in one grand realization. A name changes on an official document. A new authority is invoked. A tax obligation travels upward through a different imperial chain. Soldiers speak another language. A governor's command arrives from farther away. A local family with good connections adjusts quickly and calls it prudence. Another family calls it surrender, but quietly, because surviving people learn the cost of dramatic vocabulary. The hidden cost of Babylon's wealth was that it required constant negotiation with stronger forces. Wealth attracts administration, and administration attracts conquest. A rich city is not merely a comfortable place to live. It is a target with storehouses. It is a prize with temples. It is a map point that makes ambitious kings begin sentences with, naturally. Babylon could awe the world, but awe does not protect you from an army that also understands logistics. Persian rule did not end Babylon's cultural importance. In some ways, it confirmed it. The city remained significant within the Achaemenid Empire, and later, when Alexander the Great defeated the Persians, Babylon again became a prize of enormous symbolic value. Alexander entered Babylon in 331 BCE, after his victory over Darius III, and according to later traditions and historical accounts, he planned major projects there and died in Nebuchadnezzar's palace in 323 BCE. That detail is almost too perfect. The young conqueror who wanted the world, dying inside the palace of an older king who had also tried to make power look eternal. But even Alexander's attention could not restore Babylon to its old centrality for long. After his death, the struggles of his successors reshaped the region. The Seleucid dynasty eventually favoured Seleucia on the Tigris, a new foundation better suited to their political and administrative world. Babylon did not vanish instantly, but its importance declined. People moved, institutions weakened, temples lost old patterns of support. The city that had once gathered movement began to watch movement gather elsewhere. That may be the saddest kind of urban decline, not catastrophe, but replacement. The road bends, the offices move, the ambitious families leave. The old neighbourhoods continue for a while, but the future has started taking a different route. A city can survive its own fall and still lose the argument. This is the pressure point in Babylon's story. Its wealth had depended on concentration of water, labour, grain, gods, records, tribute, meaning. Its decline came when concentration shifted. The river was still there, the bricks were still there, the name still thundered in memory. But power is not only a thing you possess, it is a flow that must keep choosing you. Once trade, administration, royal attention, and sacred prestige begin to flow around a city rather than through it, the walls may remain standing, while the city becomes slowly less necessary. And nothing wounds a great city more quietly than becoming unnecessary. The brick returns here, but changed. Earlier, it was labour becoming architecture. Then it was royal ambition becoming display. Now it is endurance without command. A brick in a declining wall does not know the empire has moved. It still holds its place. It still carries the weather. It still remembers the mould, the hand, the stamp, the kiln, the cart, the wall. But memory is not the same as power. The brick can remain after the office closes, after the procession fades, after the temple loses wealth, after the king's language becomes an old inscription. That is why Babylon's hidden cost was never just the suffering it caused others, though that suffering matters deeply. It was also the cost of building an identity so grand that ordinary change felt like cosmic insult. A small town can decline modestly. A giant symbolic city must decline under the weight of its own metaphor. Every lost function becomes a sign. Every broken wall becomes moral evidence. Every abandoned space seems to whisper that eternity was always exaggerating. Babylon had taught the world to read cities as destiny. So when Babylon weakened, the world read weakness as judgment. The human cost is easiest to miss because great cities train the eye upward. We look at gates, walls, temples, inscriptions, royal names, and the wide, clean lines of reconstructed plans. We look at Babylon from a height, as if we were a bird, a god, an archaeologist, or a king with very flattering mapmakers. But ordinary people did not experience the city from above. They experienced it at shoulder level, at wrist level, at the level of a basket handle digging into skin, a child's fever, a creditor's visit, a ration line, a doorway watched by someone who had the authority to say no. Babylon's story becomes more honest when the camera lowers. In an imperial city, human beings arrived in many ways. Some came willingly, drawn by trade, work, temple service, family ties, or the magnetic pull of opportunity. A great city has always had that power. It whispers that somewhere inside its walls there is a better wage, a better patron, a better buyer, a better marriage, a better god to petition, a better chance. Others arrived under pressure: soldiers, labourers, dependents, enslaved people, deported communities, and people whose lives have been rearranged by decisions made far away in palaces, where the furniture was probably more comfortable than the consequences. The Babylonian deportations from Judah sit here with particular weight. They should not be treated as the whole story of Babylon, but they cannot be treated as a footnote either. The Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar II campaigned in the Levant, and the exile remembered in Jewish tradition became one of the most powerful ways Babylon entered later moral memory. For those taken from Jerusalem and Judah, Babylon was not first a wonder of architecture. It was displacement. It was the terrible education of learning a new city or carrying the shape of the old one inside you. Exile is not only movement, it is interruption. A person can be moved across land and still feel the original doorway in the body. The lost field, the broken temple, the missing grave, the familiar hill, the family house, the street where everyone knew your name and your mistakes in equal measure, all of that travels without permission. Babylon could receive people physically, but it could not decide what they remembered. That is one of the limits of empire. It can move bodies more easily than it can edit longing. Inside Babylonia, deported communities did not simply dissolve. Evidence from later cuneiform archives, including documents connected with Judean communities in Babylonia, shows that some exiles and their descendants lived, worked, borrowed, leased, paid, named children, and navigated the economic life around them. That is not a cheerful correction to exile. It is a human one. People under empire still have to cook. They still have to make arrangements. They still need witnesses, tools, neighbours, marriages, debts, and ways to survive Tuesday afternoon. Oppression does not pause ordinary life. It forces ordinary life to continue under a lowered ceiling. There is dignity in that continuation, but we should not mistake dignity for comfort. The same applies to enslaved people in Babylonian society. Their presence appears in legal and economic documents with a dryness that can feel almost brutal. A person may be listed as part of a transaction, a household, a labour arrangement, a temple economy, or an inheritance matter. The tablet does not gasp, the tablet records. That calm is part of what makes it hard to read. Violence does not always arrive in shouting language. Sometimes it arrives in excellent formatting. To be enslaved in such a world was to live inside someone else's claim. The exact conditions varied widely by period, owner, skill, household, and institution. Some enslaved people might manage property, conduct limited transactions, or occupy roles more complex than the simplest image of forced labour allows. But complexity must not become comfort. Legal capacity in certain contexts did not cancel ownership. Skill did not cancel vulnerability. Proximity to a wealthy household did not cancel the fact that your movement, labour, family life, and body could be controlled by another person. The city's order reached deepest where it could turn dependency into routine. Debt created another kind of narrowing. It did not always enslave, and it did not always destroy. Loans were part of economic life. They could help people bridge a bad harvest, finance activity, or survive a difficult season. But debt in an agricultural and urban economy could become a trap with a calm face. Interest, obligation, collateral, delayed payment, family pressure, and future labour could gather around a household until every morning began with yesterday's shortage. The terrible thing about debt is that it makes the future arrive early, already angry. A poor family in Babylon did not need to understand imperial theology to feel power. They felt it when grain was short. They felt it when a document mattered more than their explanation. They felt it when a landlord, creditor, official, owner, or patron had the social weight to make them wait. They felt it in the difference between a door that opened and a door that stayed closed. Power is not always spectacular. Sometimes it is being able to make someone stand outside. And yet the city also gave people tools. That is the difficult honesty. Written agreements, witnesses, court procedures, family arrangements and recognized claims could protect as well as constrain. A woman's dowry claim might be preserved, a sale could be confirmed, an adoption could clarify inheritance, a labor agreement could set expectations, a court could, at least in some cases, restrain private vengeance or settle a conflict before it became bloodier. Babylon was not a nightmare machine in which every institution only crushed downward. It was more unsettling than that. It was a machine people needed, feared, used, resented, trusted, and tried to survive. The human cost of such a city is not merely suffering, it is dependence on the very systems that can injure you. A market could cheat you, but you still needed the market. A court could reflect hierarchy, but you still might need the court. A temple could absorb wealth, but you still might seek the god. A palace could command labour, but palace demand also fed workshops, transport, and skilled production. The archive could trap your debt, but it could also preserve your claim. The city tightened around people, and people learned to breathe through its knots. That is perhaps the most intimate thing about Babylon, how much of its grandeur was built from managed vulnerability. Not abstract labour, but tired hands. Not abstract population movement, but families learning new streets. Not abstract taxation, but grain measured away from one store and into another. Not abstract law, but a person waiting to hear whether the tablet says hope or ruin. The walls were not only built to impress outsiders, they also enclosed all these smaller negotiations. The baker watching grain prices, the widow guarding a claim, the debtor calculating a season, the enslaved worker measuring what could be said safely, the child of deportees hearing two worlds in one household, the priest checking ritual correctness, the scribe trying to make wet clay behave before it dried into someone's future. That is, the city under the city. It is easy to say Babylon gathered wealth. It is harder, and more necessary, to say what wealth was made from. It was made from fields and rivers, yes. From trade and tribute, yes. From temples, palaces, law and record-keeping. But it was also made from the discipline of ordinary bodies, carrying, grinding, waiting, kneeling, rowing, building, witnessing, obeying, remembering, and sometimes enduring what the official story preferred to call order. A stamped brick survives beautifully in a museum case. A worker's shoulder does not. That is why we keep returning to the brick. It is the one honest object. It lets the king boast, but it also remembers the mud. It lets the wall rise, but it does not hide the hand that shaped it. It can carry a royal name for 26 centuries, while the person who made it disappears. Babylon's tragedy is not that the brick survives. The tragedy is that the brick often survives better than the human life it costs. What remains is not only the city, but the argument over how to read it. Babylon is one of those places where evidence and imagination keep stepping on each other's feet. The bricks are real. The tablets are real. The royal names, the temple districts, the Persian conquest, the Ishtar Gate, the Processional Way, the long history of building and rebuilding, these are not dreams. But around those solid things gathers a mist of later storytelling, moral interpretation, religious memory, classical wonder, excavation history, museum display, nationalist ambition, and popular fantasy. Babylon is not difficult because we know nothing. Babylon is difficult because we know many things unevenly, and the famous parts are not always the most secure. That is where a careful history has to slow down. The Ishtar Gate, for instance, lets us speak with more confidence than many other famous Babylonian images. It was built in the Neo-Babylonian period, around the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II as a monumental entrance on the city's ceremonial route, using glazed brick and animal imagery connected to divine power. The Processional Way, with its lions and ritual movement, is also part of the recoverable Babylon that archaeology and scholarship can discuss with real substance. The blue is not merely legend. The bricks were made, fired, arranged, buried, excavated, reconstructed, moved, argued over, and displayed. Even ore, in this case, has an inventory number. But the Hanging Gardens are different. They are the famous guest who keeps being invited to Babylon's dinner, even though no one can quite prove where they sat. Ancient Greek and Roman authors describe extraordinary gardens associated with Babylonian wonder, often imagined as terraces lifted above the plain, watered by ingenious devices, green enough to look like a mountain brought into a flat land. The story is irresistible because it gives Babylon softness. After so many walls, armies, laws, and tablets, here comes shade. Here comes water climbing upward. Here comes the old tale of a king building a landscape for longing. The problem is that Babylonian sources do not securely confirm the popular version. Scholars have debated whether the gardens existed in Babylon, whether classical writers confused Babylon with Assyrian Nineveh, or whether different reports of royal gardens were blended into one marvellous story. Stephanie Daly, for example, argued that the famous gardens may belong to Nineveh rather than Babylon, connecting classical descriptions with Assyrian evidence and the garden traditions of Sennacherib. That argument has not erased the traditional image from popular memory, because popular memory is not a journal article and cannot be peer-reviewed into obedience. But it does mean the honest narrator must treat the gardens not as a certain scene, but as a beautiful uncertainty with deep roots in ancient wonder writing. And honestly, that uncertainty is more interesting than a simple yes. A proven garden would be one more marvel. A disputed garden reveals how Babylon works in memory. The city became so famous for size, wealth, engineering, and royal ambition that later imagination found it plausible to attach almost any magnificence to it. Babylon did not need to possess every wonder literally in order to become the place where wonders belonged. That is a different kind of power, the power to attract stories. The Tower of Babel works in another register entirely. It belongs to biblical tradition, not to a straightforward city guide. The story of a tower, language, pride, divine intervention, and scattering has shaped the moral image of Babylon for centuries, but it cannot be handled as if someone had found a plaque saying, "Confusion began here, please queue politely." There was a great ziggurat in Babylon, Etemenanki, associated with Marduk's sacred complex, and later readers have often connected it with the Tower of Babel tradition. Ancient sources and archaeology show that Babylon did have monumental temple architecture, including the famous ziggurat, known from texts and later reconstruction debates. But the literary meaning of Babel and the archaeological history of Etemenanki are not the same thing, even if they have become intertwined in cultural memory. That distinction matters because symbols are not lies, they are just not the same as evidence. The Babel story tells us how later religious imagination understood human pride, urban concentration, language, and divine limit. It tells us that Babylon became the kind of city people could use to think about ambition becoming too tall. It does not give us a transcript of urban planning, and that is fine. A myth can preserve a human fear more powerfully than a measurement. It can tell us what a city felt like to later minds: too high, too concentrated, too confident, too close to heaven, with bad intentions and questionable scaffolding. Babylon's Persian conquest also asks for caution, but in a different way. The Cyrus cylinder presents Cyrus as a ruler favoured by Marduk, a restorer who entered Babylon and corrected the impieties of Nabonidus. It is a remarkable text because it shows the conqueror adopting Babylonian political and religious language rather than simply imposing an outside story. But it is still royal propaganda, written in the polished voice of legitimacy. It tells us how Cyrus wanted his rule understood. It does not hand us the private emotions of every Babylonian watching the transfer of power. Royal texts are like palace mirrors. They reflect something real, but never by accident. Greek sources bring their own problems. Herodotus and later classical writers helped transmit Babylon's reputation to the Mediterranean imagination, but they wrote from particular positions, with limited access, inherited stories, comparisons, misunderstandings, and a taste for memorable description. Sometimes they preserve valuable information, sometimes they magnify rumour, sometimes they make Babylon sound as if it were designed mainly to astonish Greek readers after dinner. A careful history does not throw them away, but it does not let them drive unsupervised. Biblical sources, too, must be read with care and respect for genre. They preserve deep memories of conquest, exile, grief, judgment, survival, and hope. They are not neutral administrative reports, and they were never trying to be. Their Babylon is the city seen through trauma and theology. That makes them historically precious, not historically simple. They tell us how empire was remembered by those who suffered under it. They tell us what Babylon meant when home had been lost. They tell us why the city's name could become a wound that later generations kept touching. The tablets, meanwhile, are quieter and in some ways more ruthless. Contracts, receipts, loans, astronomical observations, school texts, administrative lists, temple records. These give us Babylon not as symbol, but as habit. They show people doing the small, repeatable things that make societies last. Measuring, borrowing, hiring, witnessing, offering, selling, inheriting, calculating, watching the sky, naming children, and trying to keep tomorrow from becoming unmanageable. They are less famous than gardens and towers, but they may be closer to the city's pulse. Still, even tablets have limits. Archives preserve what institutions cared to write down. They overrepresent people who dealt with property, officials, temples, courts, and contracts. They do not equally preserve jokes, lullabies, resentment muttered under breath, the smell of cheap stew, the loneliness of a deported grandmother, or the moment someone looked at the blue gate and felt nothing because their feet hurt. Archaeology gives us material truth, but not total truth. Text gives us voices, but not everyone's voice. So the honest Babylon is layered. There is the excavated Babylon of brick, gate, street, temple, and tablet. There is the royal Babylon of inscriptions, where kings repair the universe with building projects and flattering verbs. There is the captives' Babylon, remembered through loss. There is the Greek Babylon, enlarged by wonder. There is the biblical Babylon, sharpened into moral symbol. There is the museum Babylon, fragmented, lit, labelled, and made safe behind glass. And somewhere beneath all of them is the lived Babylon, the city of heat, grain, debt, ritual, work, ambition, and dust. The task is not to choose one and declare the others false. The task is to know which Babylon is speaking. The strange afterlife of Babylon begins when the city no longer has to be powerful in order to be useful. A living capital needs canals, officials, labour, walls, storehouses, and political attention. A symbolic city needs only a name. Once Babylon became a name large enough to hold empire, exile, luxury, arrogance, confusion, splendour, and collapse, it could travel farther than any army that had ever marched from its gates. It could appear in scripture, sermons, poems, political speeches, paintings, operas, museum galleries, novels, and late-night documentaries watched by people who have never stood near the Euphrates, and maybe under a blanket, eating something Babylonian scribes would have found both suspicious and badly documented. That is the final power of famous ruins. They become portable. The actual city declined over time, its institutions weakened, its population shifted. Later settlements, later empires, and later priorities changed the map. Seleucia drew life elsewhere. The old sacred and administrative centre lost the constant traffic that had once fed it. The temples and neighbourhoods did not all disappear in one dramatic sigh, but the future slowly stopped needing Babylon in the way Babylon needed to be needed. A city can survive many enemies, but it struggles against irrelevance. Irrelevance does not batter the gate, it changes the road. And yet, just as the physical city weakened, the imagined city grew stronger. That is almost unfair. The people who had carried bricks, measured grain, watched the river, and maintained rituals did the heavy work. Later memory got the cleaner version. It took the most striking pieces and arranged them into symbols: the proud tower, the captive people by foreign waters, the jewelled city of excess, the queenly city, the fallen city, the city of confusion, the city of wealth, the city whose name sounds like a drumbeat at the end of an empire. Real Babylon had bad smells: legal disputes, insects, bored officials, and deliveries that arrived late. Symbolic Babylon has excellent lighting. But symbolic Babylon also tells a truth of its own. Not factual detail necessarily, human truth. It became the name people used when they wanted to describe a civilization that had grown too confident in its own permanence. That is why Babylon could be moved from Mesopotamia into moral language. It could become a warning about pride because it had once looked proud. It could become a warning about wealth because it had once gathered wealth. It could become a warning about empire because people had suffered under its empire. It could become a warning about confusion because cities themselves are confusing. Many languages, many peoples, many gods, many laws, many bargains, all pressed into one crowded place and told to behave. The irony is that Babylon, the real city of scribes, became a symbol partly because other people wrote it down. Writing made Babylon powerful while it lived, and writing made Babylon powerful after it faded. The same technology that recorded debts and temple offerings carried the city into later memory through chronicles, inscriptions, scripture, classical descriptions, excavation reports, and modern scholarship. Clay tablets preserved ordinary transactions. Biblical texts preserved grief and judgment. Greek and Roman writers preserved wonder, sometimes with generous helpings of distance and imagination. Archaeologists preserved fragments by removing, cataloguing, reconstructing, and displaying them. Each act of writing or recording rebuilt Babylon in a different material: clay, parchment, stone, paper, glass case. Search result: voice. That chain is not neutral. Every age gets a Babylon it can use. For some religious traditions, Babylon became the image of human pride arranged as architecture. A city building too high, a people too confident, a worldly power glittering before judgment. For political writers, Babylon could become shorthand for corrupt empire. For artists, it offered scale and sensuality: walls, towers, gold, purple skies, doomed kings, processions, captives, feasts, and the theatrical pleasure of watching arrogance approach a trap. For modern museums, Babylon becomes something quieter and stranger. Fragments of a city that once overwhelmed bodies, now presented at eye level, neatly separated from the heat, labour, and fear that made them. A glazed lion from the Processional Way in a museum is beautiful. It is also displaced in a way that feels almost too appropriate. Once the lion helped line a sacred route through an imperial city. It instructed the viewer by repetition and scale. Now it stands under controlled light, admired by visitors who move past it with soft shoes and phones. The lion still walks, but only in the imagination. Its paws no longer lead a procession, they lead a label. This is not a reason to reject museums. Without excavation, conservation, and scholarship, much of Babylon would be far harder to know. But the museum version can make the city seem tidier than it was. Babylon behind glass is clean. Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar was not. Ancient colour was not quiet. Rituals were not silent. Streets were not empty. The Blue Gate did not exist for contemplation alone. It existed inside movement, crowding, politics, worship, dust, animals, officials, and the choreography of power. A museum fragment is like a bone from a giant creature, real, precious, and incomplete. Modern archaeology itself has its own complicated history. Excavations at Babylon, especially the German work led by Robert Koldewey from the late 19th into the early 20th century, revealed major parts of the ancient city's monumental layout and helped bring the Ishtar Gate and Processional Way into modern scholarly and public view. That work transformed Babylon from inherited legend into excavated urban space. But archaeology also belonged to a world of empires, museums, national ambitions, and uneven power over ancient heritage. Even the recovery of Babylon became part of a modern story about who gets to hold the past, who gets to interpret it, and where the fragments of a famous city should live. Babylon keeps producing imperial questions even after empire leaves it. In more recent times, the site of Babylon has also carried the weight of modern politics, restoration, damage, national identity, war, and heritage debates. Ancient ruins do not sit outside modern history. They are not asleep simply because they are old. People build around them, claim them, neglect them, protect them, misuse them, photograph them, rebuild parts of them, argue over them, and turn them into evidence for modern dreams. Babylon is especially vulnerable to this because its name is too powerful. A minor ruin can be ignored. Babylon is always being asked to stand for something. That may be the city's greatest burden. It cannot simply be itself, and perhaps no famous ancient city can. Egypt becomes mystery. Sparta becomes discipline. Rome becomes empire. Athens becomes democracy. Troy becomes doomed beauty. Babylon becomes pride and splendor under judgment. These shorthand versions are not useless, but they are dangerous when they become too comfortable. They turn living places into moral furniture. They let us point at ancient people and say, "There, that is arrogance," while politely ignoring our own towers, our own ledgers, our own labour systems, our own blue gates made of glass, steel, data, debt, and carefully managed public stories. Because the modern echo of Babylon is not that we also build ziggurats. It is that we still build systems that gather wealth, hide labour, turn record-keeping into power, make architecture speak for authority, and use spectacle to persuade people that the arrangement is natural. We still trust documents that outlive voices. We still make cities where some people get shade and others wait outside. We still turn infrastructure into pride and then act surprised when maintenance becomes political. We still let symbols become larger than the lives inside them. Babylon feels ancient because its bricks are ancient. It feels familiar because the machine never fully disappeared. And the final insight begins with that uncomfortable familiarity. Babylon is not haunting because it is alien. It is haunting because, once the blue gate and the old gods are placed at the proper distance, the city starts to look less like a vanished exception and more like an early version of habits that never left us. It gathered food, labour, belief, documents, and people into one powerful centre. It used walls to organise fear, temples to organise meaning, laws to organise conflict, archives to organise memory, and spectacle to organise awe. It turned mud into brick, brick into architecture, architecture into authority, authority into story, and story into something later generations could not stop repeating. That is why Babylon's ruin does not feel like the end of the subject. It feels like the moment the subject becomes clearer. A living Babylon could distract you with noise. The calls in the street, the river traffic, the temple duties, the market quarrels, the court cases, the building work, the festivals, the animal smell, the dust, the clay drying under the sun. All of it would have been too immediate to think of as history. Nobody walking late through Babylon with tired feet was thinking, "I am now inside one of civilization's great symbols." They were thinking about supper, safety, obligation, family, debt, heat, and whether tomorrow would be worse. History is usually invisible to the people making it. It only becomes grand once the ordinary people are gone. Ruin performs a strange kindness and a strange cruelty. It quiets the city enough for us to hear the structure, but it also removes the voices that made the structure human. A broken wall lets us see how the bricks were laid. It does not tell us who was thirsty while laying them. A tablet tells us the debt. It does not tell us how the debtor slept the night before the payment was due. A royal inscription tells us the king restored the temple. It does not tell us which worker hated the project. Which priest found comfort in it? Which child watched the procession and remembered only the colour? So the final insight must hold both truths at once. Babylon was a system, and Babylon was lived. If we only call it a system, we become cold. We turn people into examples. We speak of extraction, administration, ritual authority, imperial display, and urban concentration, as if those phrases ever carried a basket or lost a home. But if we only call it lived experience, we miss the larger machinery that made those private lives so pressured in the first place. Babylon matters because it lets us see the meeting point, the machine and the body, the archive and the hand, the temple and the kitchen, the wall and the shoulder, the king's name and the anonymous person who pressed it into wet clay. This is the place where the brick returns one last time before the ending. A brick is almost nothing. It is earth disciplined into shape. It is ordinary material made obedient. It does not gleam by nature. It does not sing. It does not explain itself. One brick is so humble that you can forget it while looking at the wall it supports. But Babylon's entire memory depends on that kind of humility, multiplied until it becomes terrifying. A million small, obedient things make something that looks inevitable. A million records make an institution. A million obligations make an economy. A million acts of labour make a king seem chosen by heaven. That is how great cities lie, without necessarily saying anything false. The wall really stands, the gate really shines. The temple really receives offerings. The archive really preserves names. The procession really moves. The law really settles disputes. The market really feeds people. The empire really protects roads and moves goods. These facts are not fake, but when they are arranged together with enough confidence, they begin to suggest that the whole arrangement is natural, eternal, and morally settled. That is the deeper illusion Babylon perfected. Not the illusion that power exists, but the illusion that power has become the shape of the world. Time is very good at insulting that illusion. Time does not need an army, though armies help. Time uses neglect, changing rivers, shifting trade routes, new capitals, worn rituals, forgotten repairs, political decisions, war, weather, looting, scholarship, tourism, and the slow embarrassment of famous names attached to empty rooms. Time does not argue with royal inscriptions. It lets them remain legible after the king is gone, which is somehow ruder. It allows Nebuchadnezzar's bricks to keep saying his name, while the city they praised becomes fragment, trench, reconstruction, memory, and debate. There is a quiet comedy in that, but it is not cruel. It is the comedy of proportion. The king says forever. The brick says, perhaps. The river says, we will see. And the river has patience. The Euphrates, altered and managed across centuries, reminds us that Babylon's foundations were never just political, they were ecological. The city's wealth depended on water made useful, and water is powerful precisely because it never fully becomes obedient. Canals silt, floods come, fields suffer, salts accumulate, channels shift. Human systems pretend to command nature, but really they negotiate with it under flattering titles. Babylon's rulers could stamp bricks, command workers, honour gods and build walls, but the whole arrangement still leaned on mud, water, seasons and maintenance. Civilization is often less a triumph over nature than a long, anxious conversation with a ditch. That may be one reason Babylon feels so modern. We also live inside systems that seem permanent until maintenance fails. Roads, servers, power grids, supply chains, courts, banks, records, ports, hospitals, water systems, food distribution, housing, schools, borders, calendars, passwords and debt. These are our tablets and canals. They make life possible. They also make life dependent. They protect us and trap us, clarify us and reduce us, remember us and misremember us. We may not bow before Marduk in a temple courtyard, but we still live among institutions that ask for trust, obedience, payments, documents, and belief. The old city becomes less distant when we stop asking whether we are better than Babylon and begin asking where our own bricks are. Not literal bricks, though those are everywhere too. The bricks of our world are forms, files, screens, badges, contracts, concrete, wires, shipping containers, zoning maps, payroll systems, water pipes, data centers, credit scores, and quiet labor performed by people whose names rarely appear on the wall. We also build blue gates. Some are made of glass, some are made of branding, some are made of security checkpoints, luxury lobbies, skyline views, government buildings, financial districts, and beautiful public spaces, cleaned by people who leave before the photographs are taken. Babylon does not accuse us by being ancient. It accuses us by being recognizable. But accusation is not the only feeling left. There is also admiration, because human beings did something astonishing there. They made a city in a difficult landscape. They learned to use clay as memory. They watched the sky and kept records with care. They built ceremonial spaces of rare power. They created legal, religious, economic, and scholarly traditions that shaped the ancient Near East and influenced later worlds. They survived collapse, conquest, rebuilding, and reinterpretation. They lived under systems that could be harsh, but they also made meaning, beauty, food, family, ritual, calculation, and hope inside them. A truthful ending cannot sneer at Babylon. It has to bow slightly, then look closely. Because the city's greatness and its cost were never separate, the same concentration that made splendor possible made domination efficient. The same archives that preserved claims could harden dependency. The same rituals that comforted a population could legitimate hierarchy. The same walls that protected residents could display imperial arrogance. The same brick that made beauty possible could carry the name of a king while hiding the worker's hand. That is why Babylon still matters after all the easy images fall away. Not because it was simply the richest city, or the wicked city, or the wonder city, or the doomed city. It matters because it shows how wealth becomes visible, how power becomes sacred, how labor becomes architecture, how records become memory, and how memory becomes myth. The city did not vanish into dust. It became a way of thinking about what cities do to the world, and what the world lets cities do to people. And so the last image should not be a palace or a king or a tower reaching too confidently toward heaven. It should be a brick. Not a grand brick, if there is such a thing. Not one still holding a wall together. Just a single stamped brick, pulled from the earth after centuries of heat, burial, damage, silence, and rediscovery. It might sit now behind glass, cleaned of the mud that made it, separated from the wall that gave it purpose, marked by a royal name that once tried to push itself into eternity. You can stand in front of it quietly. No procession moves past. No priest chants nearby. No official checks your right to enter. No donkey shoves your hip in the street. No worker curses the weight of the load. The brick has become respectable. History does that to objects. It cleans them until they almost forget how dirty they were. But the brick remembers more than it says. It remembers the river, because without water it could not have been shaped. It remembers the field, because without straw it could not have held together. It remembers the hand, because someone had to press clay into a mould. It remembers the king, because the king's name was stamped into it. It remembers the wall, because one brick alone is just a hardened piece of earth, but many bricks together can frighten strangers and make rulers feel immortal. It remembers heat, weight, labour, display, collapse, excavation, cataloguing, and the long strange journey by which mud becomes empire and empire becomes museum label. That is Babylon in miniature. For thousands of years the city kept changing shape. It was not one thing. It was an early royal capital under Hammurabi, a sacred centre of Marduk, a city claimed and damaged by Assyria, a restored imperial capital under Nebuchadnezzar II, a conquest prize for Cyrus, a place admired by Greeks, entered by Alexander, slowly overshadowed by newer centres, excavated by modern archaeologists, argued over by scholars, mourned and condemned in religious memory, and rebuilt again and again in human imagination. Its physical power faded, its symbolic power did not. In that sense, Babylon did what every king wanted and almost no king achieved. It outlived the purposes of its makers. But it did not outlive them kindly. The city's memory is full of missing people. We know the names of kings because kings made sure we would. We know some names from tablets because business, law, and institutions needed them preserved. But most lives passed through Babylon without leaving a voice that can be heard clearly now. The brickmaker, the porter, the woman managing household accounts, the enslaved worker, the temple cook, the canal labourer, the deported child learning the streets, the debtor hoping for mercy, the apprentice scribe with aching fingers, the old person watching a festival from the edge of the crowd. They are mostly gone from the record as themselves. They remain as pressure, as traces, as the human weight inside the city's accomplishments. A careful history does not pretend to recover them fully. That would be another kind of theft. But it can refuse to forget that they were there. Because Babylon's story is not only the story of wealth, it is the story of what wealth requires before it can shine. Water must be guided, food must be grown, labour must be organised, records must be kept, gods must be served, laws must be spoken, walls must be repaired, enemies must be resisted or conquered, captives must be moved, debt must be managed, ritual must return with the calendar. A city must persuade its inhabitants that the arrangement has meaning, even when the arrangement is heavy. And Babylon was very good at meaning. It taught people that a city could be more than crowded shelter. It could be a cosmic centre. It could be the house of a god, the stage of a king, the memory of an empire, the wound of an exile, the envy of a visitor, the warning of a preacher, the puzzle of an archaeologist, and the dream of anyone who has ever looked at a skyline and felt that human beings are both magnificent and slightly out of control. Babylon became a place where the city itself seemed to stand up and say, "Look what can be gathered." Grain, labour, silver, bricks, gods, languages, captives, laws, stories, fear, admiration, all gathered. That gathering was Babylon's genius and its danger. To gather is to create possibility. A city can make knowledge denser, trade easier, ritual grander, art more ambitious, memory more durable, and strangers suddenly useful to one another. But to gather is also to concentrate power. It makes extraction easier. It makes inequality visible and then normal. It lets a small group sit near the centre, while many others carry the outer weight. It lets records protect the vulnerable in one case and trap them in another. It lets beauty rise high enough that people stop asking, for a moment, who mixed the clay. The final lesson is not that Babylon was wicked and we are wise. That is much too comfortable. The final lesson is that Babylon shows us a pattern we still live inside. We still gather wealth and call the gathering progress. We still build institutions that protect and reduce us at the same time. We still trust records more than voices when the records are convenient. We still let impressive buildings suggest that the power inside them must be legitimate. We still admire blue gates without always asking about the hands. And yet we still build, because we have to. That is the tenderness underneath the darkness. Human beings build cities not only from greed or pride, but from need. We need water closer, food stored, skills shared, gods honoured, children protected, trade made possible, disputes settled, memory held somewhere outside the fragile body. Babylon was harsh because ancient life was harsh, and because power makes itself comfortable wherever humans gather. But it was also astonishing because people made order in a difficult landscape, and then made that order beautiful enough to be remembered long after it stopped working. So we should leave Babylon neither condemned nor romanticised. Leave it at dusk when the heat is finally thinning. The river moves darkly beyond the walls. A worker rinses clay from his hands. Somewhere a tablet is drying. Somewhere bread is being broken. Somewhere a priest worries that the ritual must be done correctly. Somewhere a family speaks in the low, tired voices of people who have survived another day inside a great city's appetite. The blue gate catches the last light and, for a moment, looks almost unreal. But it is real. That is the strange thing. The myth was built from something real. Real mud, real hands, real fear, real hunger, real skill, real beauty, real violence, real hope. Babylon did not become immortal because it escaped the ordinary world. It became immortal because it gathered the ordinary world so intensely that later generations could not stop seeing themselves in it. The city fell out of power. The name did not. And somewhere, behind glass or under earth, a brick still carries a king's boast in baked clay, while saying something the king never meant to say. Babylon was not a golden dream that turned to dust. It was mud, shaped by human hands, arranged into power, and remembered as eternity.